A princess story that was supposed to feel like magic somehow turned into controversy. In 1997, Brandy Norwood stepped into the glass slippers as Cinderella in Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella, a role that would go on to define a generation. On paper, it was groundbreaking. A black woman as Cinderella, a multiracial cast, a reimaging of a classic fairy tale that didn't follow Hollywood's traditional rules. But what should have been a celebration quickly became a conversation, because behind the praise, the ratings, and the iconic performances from names like Whitney Houston and Paulo Montalban, there was backlash. Not just quiet criticism, but loud, uncomfortable reactions that exposed something deeper about the entertainment industry and the audience watching it. Comments flooded in questioning the casting. People debated whether the story was realistic, and for some viewers, the issue wasn't the singing or the acting. It was the fact that Cinderella didn't look the way they expected her to. This wasn't just about a movie, it was about who gets to be seen as timeless, who gets to represent fantasy, and who audiences are willing to accept in roles that were never originally written for them. And for Brandy, this moment would cement her legacy, but also place her at the center of a cultural debate that still hasn't fully gone away. Because the real question is, was the backlash about the film or about what it represented? Before the fame, the accolades, and the industry narratives that would later follow her, Brandy Rayana Norwood's story begins in a space that almost feels destined for music. Born on February 11, 1979 in Macomb, Mississippi, and raised in Carson, California, Brandy grew up in a deeply musical and faith-centered household. Her father, Willie Norwood, was a gospel singer and choir director, which meant music wasn't just something she liked. It was something she was trained in, surrounded by, and expected to understand at a technical level from an early age. That foundation matters because it's what later shaped the very thing Brandy is most respected for: her intricate vocal layering, runs, and harmonies that would go on to influence an entire generation of R&B artists. Before she was a household name, Brandy was doing what a lot of future stars do, but rarely get credited for: singing backup for youth groups, auditioning constantly, and being molded early by the industry. Her big turning point came when she signed with Atlantic Records as a teenager, and this is where everything shifted. In 1994, Brandy released her self-titled debut album, Brandy, and this wasn't just a quiet introduction. It immediately positioned her as a fresh face in R&B, a teen star with vocal maturity beyond her age, a crossover artist with both commercial and cultural appeal. With hits like I Wanna Be Down, Baby, and Broken Hearted, Brandy didn't just enter the industry, she secured a lane in it. At the same time her music career was rising, Brandy expanded into television, something that would elevate her from singer to full-on cultural icon. Her starring role in the sitcom Moesha made her one of the most visible young black women on television in the late 90s. And then came a defining moment in representation: Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella. Brandy became the first black actress to play Cinderella in a major production, something that, at the time, quietly challenged industry norms about who gets to embody classic roles. By 1998, Brandy reached another level with her second album, Never Say Never. This wasn't just successful, it was defining. The album produced Have You Ever, which hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and The Boy Is Mine. Her duet with Monica spent 13 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, becoming one of the biggest songs of the decade and earning both artists a Grammy Award. At this point, Brandy wasn't just successful, she was a defining voice of late 90s and R&B. Instead of staying in the safe lane, Brandy began experimenting sonically. She released Full Moon in 2002, which had futuristic and electronic R&B influences. Then she released Aphrodisiac in 2004, which had a more darker, more ambient, emotionally layered sound to it. So these albums didn't just show growth, they helped shape the sound of modern alternate R&B that artists today still draw from. Brandy continued evolving beyond music. She went on to be a judge on America's Got Talent in 2006. She was also a competitor on Dancing with the Stars in 2010, And she also had a Broadway debut for the play Chicago as Roxy Hart in 2015. Musically, she continued releasing projects including 211 in 2012, B7 in 2020, and Christmas with Brandy in 2023. With over 17 million records sold in the US, a Grammy Award, and an American Music Award, Brandy's career is not just about longevity, it's about impact. She is often referred to as the vocal Bible, not because she was the loudest or the most commercial at every stage, but because her vocal technique became a blueprint, her tone became instantly recognizable, and her influence quietly shaped artists who came after her. Brandy's story isn't just girl becomes star. It's a young, highly trained Black artist entering an industry that both elevated and limited her at the same time. And that duality, that's exactly where the dark truths start to unfold later.
My dreams came true. And I think people do think that about me. But then again, I'm not her. I'm not Cinderella. I'm a hard-working young lady.
All that hard work paid off in 1997 when a fairy godmother in the form of Whitney Houston asked Brandy to star in the TV movie of Cinderella, which Ms. Houston just happened to be executive producing.
Brandy.
Cinderella was a rating success, but it did raise some eyebrows with its non-traditional casting choices.
Love has no color. Love is colorblind, and it doesn't matter. And the prince was Asian. You don't see that. You don't see Asian princes. You don't at all. And that made a huge impact. A lot of people liked it. A lot of people didn't. But the people who didn't like it, they think about it.
To understand why Brandy's Cinderella mattered so much, you have to remember what the late 90s entertainment world actually looked like. Hollywood was still living in a very specific fantasy. The it girls were being packaged in a very narrow way. Disney princess imagery, especially in mainstream culture, was still coded as white, delicate, European, and untouchable. And even outside of Disney, a lot of Black actresses were being pushed into best friend, sassy, struggle, or urban realism lanes, while fairy tales stayed gated. Meanwhile, the music industry was booming, especially teen and pop adjacent R&B. You had the whole era where young artists were becoming brands overnight. Music, interviews, sitcoms, red carpets, the whole thing. Brandy wasn't just a singer, she was a full-on multimedia star by the mid-90s. And then this TV movie dropped in 1997 like a glitter bomb. Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella on ABC. Brandy as Cinderella, Whitney Houston as the fairy godmother, a fully multicultural cast that didn't stop to explain itself. And today, people call it iconic. But back then, that casting was quietly controversial. Not always in the headlines making way, but in the we're uncomfortable and we don't want to admit it why way. This version of Cinderella wasn't an accident. It was a choice. Whitney Houston was one of the driving forces behind the film and helped bring it to life as a producer. And she ultimately offered the Cinderella role to Brandy, and the production leaned into something that was still rare on TV at the time: colorblind, multicultural casting. A Cinderella with braids, a Filipino prince, a Black queen, and a white king, and the world just moves like that's normal. It premiered November 2nd, 1997, and it wasn't some niche moment either. This was a massive TV event, pulling in around 60 million viewers and giving ABC a major ratings win. So here's the gag. Even with all that success, even with Whitney Houston attached, even with it being family programming, there was still resistance behind the scenes to the idea of a Black Cinderella. One account notes that a Disney executive suggested a white Cinderella instead, while keeping Whitney as a fairy godmother, basically trying to split the difference. The producers refused because the whole point was the legacy of a Black Cinderella. And that right there tells you everything. Because if it was truly no big deal, nobody would have tried to negotiate her Blackness. Let's be real, the 90s didn't have social media the way we do now, so the backlash didn't always show up as trending outrage. It showed up as people calling it weird without saying why, critics obsessing over the cast race like it was a math problem, media framing it like an odd experiment instead of a normal fairy tale. The multicultural casting became such a talking point that some media literally nicknamed it a Rainbow Cinderella. Notice how nobody calls an all-white cast a vanilla Cinderella. It's only a thing when whiteness isn't centered. And even when the backlash wasn't front-page racism, it lived in the subtext. But Cinderella is supposed to be, how do they have a prince that looks like that with parents that look like that? Why are they making it political? Because here's the reality. Fairy tales were treated like white property. So when a black girl steps into a role of the chosen one, the girl who gets the gown, the prince, the magic, the happy ending, it challenges a lot of people's default setting. The real controversy wasn't just Brandy's casting, it was what it symbolized. Because a black Cinderella wasn't only representation, it was a message. That black girls can be the center of softness, that black femininity can be treated like something precious, that we can exist in fantasy, not just survival stories. And that disrupts a long-running cultural norm. Princess equal white. That's why the resistance existed, even if it wasn't always screamed. And that's also why years later, people look back and say the casting was groundbreaking, because it was. The dark truth is this. Brandy's Cinderella proved that representation was still controversial, even in a fairy tale. And the fact that producers had to stand their ground, even with Whitney Houston involved, shows that the industry wasn't simply ready. It was being pushed. And when something has to be pushed into existence, that means it was being resisted. Even if it was quiet, even if it was coded as concern, even if it was disguised as traditional, the discomfort was real. I'm sure a lot of you remember, but this is where Brandy's Cinderella moment connects directly to what happened to Halle Bailey. Because if Brandy's backlash in 1997 was quiet, whispers in boardrooms, coded comments, concerns behind the scenes, Halle Bailey's backlash was loud, global, algorithm-fed, and nonstop. Not because the world got better, but because by the time Halle was cast as Ariel, we had something Brandy didn't have to face: social media and the culture war machine that comes with it. When Disney announced in 2019 that Halle Bailey would play Ariel, it was the middle of the live-action remake era. Disney was rebuilding classic animations into blockbuster event fumes, and every casting choice became a referendum. And online culture in 2019 worked like this. One screenshot becomes a headline, one hashtag becomes a movement, and outrage becomes entertainment. So the backlash wasn't just some people didn't like it, it became a campaign. The Not My Ariel reaction and comments exploded in waves, and outlets later described it as a predictable cycle. A black woman gets a traditionally white fantasy role, and the internet turns it into a battlefield. Then it flared again in 2022 when the trailer dropped, because now people weren't debating a casting announcement. They were reacting to her face on screen, shared millions of times, stitched, duetted, and dragged across platforms. The core argument people used was never really about acting. It was canon, it was accuracy, and it was, she doesn't look like the cartoon. But the pattern was obvious. The outrage wasn't about Ariel being a mermaid. It was about Ariel being black. Even the director, Rob Marshall, later acknowledged the reactions to his backlash, and talked about how archaic it felt that people were still upset over a woman of color being cast. And Halle herself has spoken about how, as a black person, you kind of expect that negativity, because you already know how people react when you're placed in roles they don't think you belong in. Here's the difference. Brandy's backlash was filtered through executives, press gatekeepers, and water cooler chatter. Halle's backlash was instant, viral, personal, and monetized, because controversy gets clicks. It wasn't just people are mad. It was people quote tweeting, stitching, reaction videoing, and building entire online brands off being offended. That's why this moment proves something important. Representation didn't stop being controversial. It just became more profitable to attack. Now, real talk, most of the nastiest commentary came from regular social media users and culture war accounts. There were public figures who dog whistled it or used it as wake Disney talking points. For example, Megyn Kelly publicly criticized Disney diversity direction and referenced the casting of Halle Bailey as Ariel while framing it as part of broader DEI push. Mena Massoud caught backlash after posting comments comparing Disney's support and the box office expectation around The Little Mermaid. It wasn't a direct attack on Halle personally, but it fed into the online pile-on narrative at the worst possible moment. And that matters because when a famous name signals skepticism, even subtly, the internet uses it like permission. See, even they think it's too much. At the same time, a lot of public figures stepped in to protect Halle and shut down the noise. Donald Glover defended her casting early on. Jodie Benson, the original voice of Ariel, spoke out in support, and Josh Good publicly called out the backlash because everyone understood what was really happening. They weren't just arguing about a mermaid, they were arguing about who gets to be seen as magical. And this is where it loops back to Brandy. If social media existed in 1997, Brandy wouldn't have just gotten quiet backlash. She would have gotten hashtags, reaction videos, trending outrage, think pieces, fake controversy clips, and strangers trying to debate her right to exist in a princess role. Halle Bailey showed us what Brandy was spared by timing: the brutality of mass access to someone's identity as public property. So yes, Brandy's Cinderella was revolutionary, but Halle's Ariel proved something darker. Even decades later, some people still treat black girls in fairy tales like a disruption instead of a normal part of the story. Here's what history keeps doing. It repeats itself, then pretends it didn't. Because years from now, people are going to talk about Halle Bailey's Ariel the same way they talk about Brandy's Cinderella today. They're going to call it iconic. They're going to call it revolutionary. They're going to say, wow, representation matters. But during the actual release, Halle had to walk through a storm. When Disney announced her casting in 2019, the backlash started immediately, and Halle even said she was choosing not to pay attention to the negativity. Then, when the trailer dropped in 2022, it flared back up again on an even bigger scale, and Halle spoke about how overwhelming it could be. And yet, at the same time, we also saw the other side of this: little black girls reacting with pure joy because for once, a princess looked like them. So let's just say it again plainly. Halle's backlash wasn't about a mermaid, it was about who people think is allowed to be magical. And that's what makes Brandy's moment hit even harder. Because Brandy's Cinderella aired in 1997 and pulled over 60 million viewers, a massive TV event, while still dealing with quiet resistance to the idea of a black Cinderella. Quiet meaning no TikTok stitches, no quote tweet dog pals, no algorithm pushing rage to the top of everyone's feed. If social media existed back then, Brandy would have been dealing with hashtags, think pieces, and strangers debating her existence in a princess role in real time, the exact kind of pile-on Halle had to face. So when people act like the 90s were so innocent, no, the world wasn't more accepting, it was just less connected. And I'm not even speaking from a distance, I'm speaking from childhood. Me personally, I loved Brandy's Cinderella as a kid because I was already a Brandy fan. Back then, I watched Moesha every week. I listened to her music. I also had her Barbie doll. She was everywhere and I was locked in. And that matters because that era had so many huge dominating. You had Destiny's Child, you had Spice Girls, you had Britney Spears, you also had Christina Aguilera. Everybody had their own lane and everybody had their moment. But Brandy's impact was different because she didn't just give songs, she gave visibility. She gave a whole generation a version of a fairy tale where the girl at the center looked like us, and it didn't need to come with the struggle storyline attached. Which brings me to this point. If Hollywood ever did something like a live action Princess and the Frog and cast a white princess, that wouldn't be unique and it honestly wouldn't be a dig. That would actually be returning it to the default because the overwhelming majority of princess stories have historically centered whiteness as the standard. The only reason it would feel controversial is because Hollywood knows outrage travels. And the darkest part is, representation becomes a debate only when black girls are placed in the roles that were never meant for them in people's minds. That's the pattern. Brandy showed it in 1997, Halle showed it again in the social media era. And history is going to flip the narrative later, like it always does. So, I want to ask you, do you think the backlash is getting worse? Or is it just getting louder because of social media? And what's one casting choice you think will be called iconic 10 years from now, even if people dragged it when it happened? If you enjoyed this breakdown and you want more deep dives into the industry, representation, politics, and the dark truths behind the headlines, make sure you like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments because I will be reading them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.